Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MSPS Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 27th of June 2024. This is a geopolitical video talking about all the ideas concerning the war in Ukraine as the effects of the war in Ukraine reach out globally and indeed those global entities reach into Ukraine as well. It is such an important moment in time, what we are experiencing or what the Ukrainians are more directly experiencing. Right, let's start with Ukraine and the EU are to sign a security agreement together, ensuring Kiev will receive ongoing arms training and other security assistance for the foreseeable future. Indeed, Zelensky is there in Brussels to sign 3 security agreements. These treaties will ensure that all 27 EU member states are committed to providing Ukraine with extensive support regardless of any institutional changes within the Union. That's so important. So thinking about the winds of political change that we might be seeing in the US, that we might be seeing in France, and if there can be some kind of legal framework that that contracts, if you like, EU support to Ukraine over the long term, despite any political changes, then that's really beneficial for Ukraine. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has rejected calls for a peace talk for peace talks with Putin. Quote, Putin, he says in Die Welt, continues to focus entirely on war and rearmament. No one can ignore this, the German Chancellor said in a speech actually to the Bundestag, the German Parliament. Scholz said, anyone who believes that territorial and political concessions to Putin from Ukraine will lead to lasting peace in Europe probably watches a lot of Russia today. Well said there. Now, Russia is possibly in a little bit more of an economic quagmire than they might like you to believe. Yanis Kluger here says, over the past 6 months, Russia's economy has grown just 0.3%. He's deputy head of Eastern Europe and Eurasia division for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Russia and Economics expertise. So the Russia's economy has grown just 0.3% according to the GDP index of VEB. It appears like growth has hit its ceiling last October and the economy is now stagnating. And this is what he said on June the 16th. Looking at this, Putin likes to boast about Russia's year-over-year GDP growth of 5.4% in quarter one, but year-on-year statistics can be deceiving. Russia's economy has grown 2.5% over the past 2.5 years, or 1% per year on average. Pre-war forecast was 3%. Sanctions hurt, energy prices and war spending has helped. So, in other words, energy prices going up and war spending increasing your GDP has helped to inflate figures in a kind of unnatural way, arguably. Well, not an unnatural way, but being on a war footing makes your GDP look certainly a lot better than it otherwise would. Right. On the other hand, Ukraine has a 6.5% GDP increase is on track for that this year, and IKEA deciding to reopen stores in Kiev. That is very important and possibly shows that there is commercial confidence in air defences around Kiev and about the future of the war and Ukraine in general. So good news there. Now going back to Julian Assange, who has been recently flown into Australia via a US embassy somewhere in the Indian Ocean, I think somewhere around, where he signed. Well, he agreed that he had committed espionage as part of the agreement for him to be released and to go back to Australia. Anyway, as Thomas van Linger here says, everyone celebrating Assange as a hero of the free press should read this piece. In the aftermath of the 2010 Belarusian elections, WikiLeaks actively aided Lukashenko in identifying and cracking down on pro-democracy activists and boasted about it afterwards. So just be a little wary about how much you appreciate Julian Assange. Oliver Carroll here says, from a prominent Belarusian opposition politician, Assange is no hero and no journalist. He and his colleagues put so many human lives in mortal danger, not only of the US intelligence and their sources, but also of freedom fighters. His man Shamir informed on the Belarus opposition, helping to jail us. It's literally having the opposite, having a deleterious effect on democracy around the world. So, it is a complex matter, the Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and how we evaluate it morally. But there's certainly many instances where what he did was definitely not cool, as I like to say. Now, next, they're talking about Belarus, has said that the ex-ambassador of Belarus to Germany has committed suicide. He couldn't stand a KGB interrogation, says Nexter. According to Nasha, former Belarusian ambassador to Germany, Denis Sidorenko, committed suicide by, you guessed it, jumping from a multi-story building. It happened on, I say that as like it's falling off out of a window. Did he really jump, or, so I don't know, but it's just screams Russian interference there, or Belarusian interference. But the Belarusian Foreign Ministry reported about Sidorenko's death only today without giving details. According to Nasha, after returning from his ambassadorial trip to Germany, Sidorenko became the object of the KGB attention. Apparently, he couldn't stand what was going on, added another informed interlocutor. Minsk says that all career diplomats who return from the EU are now becoming the objects of detailed operational scrutiny by the special services. Denis Sidorenko was Belarus's ambassador to Germany from 2016 to 2024. He was dismissed from this position by decree of Lukashenko on March the 11th. He was not given a new position in the foreign ministry. Earlier, some Belarusian media reported that Sidorenko died allegedly of a heart attack. Sidorenko replaced Andrei Giro, who died on November the 17th, 2015, also at the age of 48, though, from cancer. That one is slightly more believable. But yeah, anyway, that has happened. Now, quote, Russian hackers behind the NHS attack are part of a wider cyber army working under the Kremlin's protection to try to destabilize the UK ahead of the election, says iNews here, revealed Russian hackers behind the NHS attack are part of a Kremlin-protected cyber army. So this is the idea that cyber attackers or hackers or whatever operating from Russia are under their protection, but Russia has plausible deniability that it has anything to do with the government. So when you have this attack on an outsourced subcontractor to the NHS, that is meaning that still after that hacking, people are not getting blood tests done, because it's messed the whole system up. And I showed you previously that there is evidence. I think there's a paper released to say that hospitals that have been hit by ransomware attacks have higher mortality rates than hospitals that haven't. In other words, this activity literally kills people. Now, the state can get away with saying, hey, nothing to do with us, these are Russian criminals operating in Russia. But you know that kind of activity happening inside Russia is going to be happening with the permission of the state, and possibly even under the orders of the state, right? They're not going to have some big cyber crime gang operating without the FSB being on them, right? Russia would not allow that. And we know what's going on here, that this will be state sanctioned and probably state ordered, but it's that plausible deniability angle that they can always adopt. It is really troubling, and elections, I think, worldwide are going to be targeted by Russia on an ongoing basis. Now, US Ambassador Nicholas Burns has said that despite its claims of neutrality, China was providing a range of technologies to Moscow while maintaining strong trade ties with Russia throughout the conflict. This is absolutely what's going on for sure, and it's a huge worry, because I think China's providing Russia with an awful lot of information more than anything. I think satellite imagery and stuff like that for targeting is one of the biggest challenges for the Ukrainians at the moment. But certainly the Russians appear to be able to manufacture missiles at rates that, like I reported earlier, if that is true, that their rates have gone up since 2023, then I'm sure China's going to have an awful lot to do with that. And that's a challenge for the Western world and allies of Ukraine. How do we deal with that? Secondary sanctions on Chinese banking institutions is seemingly a pretty useful tool. Now, talking about China, I think this is fascinating. This is Jasmine Crockett, who's a Democrat representative in the House of Representatives, a lawmaker, and talking about China and sanctions, right? She says Trump sold out the US for Ivanka Trump. So in May 2018, I mean, it's only a minute 16 this, but I'll just summarize it. In May 2018, China approves trademarks. On May the 7th, China grants more trademarks. On May the 13th, Trump tells the Commerce Department to reverse ZTE sanctions. If you remember, so that's when he walked into the room and what was his name? Adam Kinzinger was there at the time. He's told this story where Trump walks in and they're all talking about sanctions and stuff. And he said, "Oh, can you guys lift the sanctions on this company?" And everyone's like, "Why?" He's like, "Oh, Xi Jinping asked me. So we're just going to lift those sanctions because the dictator of the country that we're sanctioning has just asked you." Literally, apparently, what happened. And then they lifted these sanctions. Anyway, it seems a little bit more complex than that, possibly, because on June the 7th, Ivanka gets 3 more trademarks and Trump lifts sanctions. And what Jasmine Crockett here does is link the lifting of sanctions. She has a chronology there that is seems to be very much in line with Ivanka Trump getting trademarks in China. Sanctions get lifted, she gets trademarks. Sanctions get lifted, she gets trademarks. I wonder why Trump lifted those sanctions. Right, okay. Just absolutely mind-blowing. And then I absolutely despise this human being. Like, with every fibre of my being. And here she is. If you have any... well, you guys are here, right? So you've got to care about Ukraine prevailing in this war. And you've got to care about Ukraine getting support in this war. Well, here's your enemy. Here is your enemy.
This whole thing is the most repulsive, disgusting thing happening, and the American people are the ones writing the check. And I absolutely hate everybody here that is doing this. I mean, I seriously hate them for doing this to the American people and paying for the murder and slaughter of people in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has not said he wants to go march across Europe and take Europe. And the reality is Ukraine is not even a NATO member nation. But if you...
Oh, that's all right. So we can just let Ukraine... Oh, he said he's not going to march across Europe, so you can just march across Ukraine. That's cool, as long as you keep it there, because we know from history that happened, right? Sudetenland and all that. So... Putin, you just march through Ukraine and we'll just Ukraine, whatever. It doesn't matter that we've been trying to help you out since 2014 and you're part of the strategic objectives of the US and of NATO, etc., etc. Like, you just go for it, Putin. You don't know what the hell you are talking about, you stupid woman.
You want to know something, Lloyd Austin and the others here, more than anything, want to send your uncles, your cousins, and your sons and daughters to the front lines in Ukraine, because that is the only country that for some weird, sick and evil reason that they care about.
So the fact that I care about Ukraine is a weird, sick and evil reason. Is a weird, sick and evil thing. Like the rationale I give. They don't want to send US troops. That's precisely why they're providing US equipment, so that they don't have to send troops, so that this doesn't expand into NATO territory. You absolute wingnut. You are so dense. Please get yourself educated. Go and sit down with Timothy Snyder for a couple of hours and come out with at least some improvement in your cognitive abilities concerning geopolitics and Ukraine. You are the dangerous one here. You are the one who is weird, sick and evil. In my books, Sunshine. My goodness. But the problem is her kind of thinking has infiltrated an area of the Republican Party, and it is truly worrying. It's great news that people like Adam Kinzinger, who is a huge supporter of Ukraine, you can tell Adam Kinzinger brackets Slava Ukraini, and in his title he has that as his name, Slava Ukraini. I really want to talk to him. Actually, I want to interview Adam Kinzinger. He's come out and endorsed Biden, and a lot of what's behind that, and yes, he's part of January the 6th, and he was essentially expelled from the party on the back of trying to support the rule of law with regard to not having the Capitol stormed. But he says, I didn't change. The GOP did. They went from a commitment to principles to a commitment to a weak, whiny, small and victim-obsessed man. It's a cult, he said. So when you listen to him talk often about, anything at the moment, he so often leverages in to the conversation Ukraine. I was listening to him on Pod Save America yesterday, where he was looking at political ads, and even at the end of that, he is like he couldn't refrain from talking about Ukraine in there because it's so important to him. So I've got a lot of time for Adam Kinzinger because I'm not going to agree with him wholeheartedly politically, but he understands the importance of Ukraine. He really does. And he understands the importance, like strategically for the US. It's not just a moral thing, it's a strategic thing. And he's a veteran himself, and he's someone that's been involved in intelligence briefings in Congress. Yeah, he knows his onions with regard to this stuff. And like, if he's worried about what's going on, then, we need to sit up and pay attention. It's interesting that, like, while Kinzinger has also supported Biden, you've got the former Georgia Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, who's come out and endorsed Biden as well. As a request for Republicans across America, don't give the depraved degenerate 4 more years, because we all know if we allow that person back into the White House, he ain't leaving till he's dead. I mean, he says a lot of interesting things, but it's about putting your country above your party here, and I think it's really important that takes place. And then when you look at, here's what Trump has said on Ukraine. Now, I think this is not a recent thing he said. This is going back earlier in the war. But actually, when you write down, there are all these claims about Biden not being cognitively all there. But actually, if you look at the language Trump uses, and there were language analyses of his language back in 2016, 2017, saying actually he's got the language ability of like an 11-year-old or whatever it was, that these linguistic analyses showed. But actually he's got worse since then. And when you look at the syntax, like syntactically how he creates his, I wouldn't say speeches, how he creates his sentences when he speaks is deeply, syntactically, it is entirely problematic. He just makes very little sense, especially when you transcribe what he says and then read it back out. So here's an example. Fox News asked Trump what he'd do differently from Biden in Ukraine. Well, what I would do is we have tremendous military capability, and what we can do without planes, to be honest with you, without 44-year-old jets, what we can do is enormous, and we should be doing it, and we should be helping them to survive, and they're doing an amazing job. It is pretty scary stuff, to be honest. Now, I've told you what I believe that about who should win the election if Ukraine is your only concern, right? There's a lot else going on in American politics, obviously, domestically speaking. And so people's votes are going to be defined by, what their beliefs are on a whole suite of different issues. But just on Ukraine, for me, the shoo-in is Biden, or should be Biden. And so when people like Adam Kinzinger come out and say this, and your Georgian Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan come out and say that they are not supporting what is going on in the Trump world, and that they are going to endorse Biden, I think that's a good thing for Ukraine.
Here you are in a new role. You're taking a stand in a significant way today. You are just endorsing Joe Biden for president. Just for a moment, when you hear Kayla's reporting on him looking straight to the camera, him connecting with people. When you think about where you were, superstar Republican congressman, and now you're here endorsing Joe Biden.
Look, that's what's amazing is, 8 years ago, I was called like a rising star in the Republican Party, and I didn't change what I believed. I mean, you grow up, a few views change, you moderate a little bit, but I'm the same person. The party has absolutely left me, because it's not swearing allegiance to any kind of principles or policy anymore. It's all about swearing allegiance to one man, who did his best to overthrow a legitimate election, convinced a third of the American people that the election was stolen, and my 2.5-year-old son deserves to be raised in a country with as strong of a democracy as I've been raised in. So it was a no-brainer for me.
And I
If any of you can help me get hold of him to interview him, that would be absolutely fantastic, because he feels so strongly about Ukraine. Now, it's really interesting. The other day, the US designated Kenya as its major non-NATO ally in the White House. I think I might mention it in conversation, but I didn't show this. This is a memorandum of the designation of Kenya as a major non-NATO ally, right? June the 24th, 3 days ago. And then basically since then, Kenya's been embroiled in some protests. And the government has been under an awful lot of pressure. There's been gunfire, all sorts. It's just interesting when Rebar, then, the very pro-Russian source, comes out with talking about protests in Kenya. Protests in Kenya over the introduction of new taxes have only gained more momentum in the first half of the week. June the 25th, thousands of protesters approached the building of the country's parliament, where law enforcers opened fire at them, but that didn't stop the rioters from storming the government building, where they began smashing the premises. The law enforcers' shelling of the protesters caused a fire in the building, as a result of which many people were poisoned by carbon monoxide, and those who tried to help the retreating protesters were sometimes killed on the spot. The Defence Ministry justified the behaviour of the law enforcers as a security emergency and danger to critical infrastructure, which is generally not far from the truth. Then, in addition to the Parliament building, the city administration also caught fire, but the rioters themselves were not the arsonists. The massacre of protesters naturally drew condemnations from Nairobi's Western partners, which forced the president to abandon the tax hike after all. This all may genuinely be, and probably is, genuinely a domestic issue in Kenya. But it seems really coincidental that Kenya is seen as a big friend of NATO, given the Sahel region just to the northwest of them, having, 7 coups in the last few years, and basically that whole region of Africa rejecting the West in favour of Russia. And then here we have a Russian source talking about the issues in Kenya, and we have, I don't know, I wonder whether there are little sticks being poked in the side of Kenya by the Russians here. There's surely going to be, as we've seen in other countries in Africa, a huge amount of information warfare taking place in Kenya, and I'm sure Russia will be involved very heavily in that. They just have a really big presence in Africa, not just in terms of boots on the ground and political presence, but also informational presence there. It's definitely something to look out for going forward. Now, we're going to end with France. I don't know whether to get into the long weeds of French politics here, but I think it is really important to understand what's going on in France in order to understand what's going on or what might happen with regard to support for Ukraine. So this is a really good thread. It's a little bit technical. Mujaba Rahman says, who is Managing Director of Eurasia Group, Senior Research Fellow in a number of places. Anyway, he says, what happens if the far right sweeps to power in France on July the 7th with a majority in the National Assembly? So as you know, Emmanuel Macron as president has he's dissolved Parliament, dissolved the National Assembly, and said we just had really bad EU elections, so we're going to have a parliamentary election early, and we'll see whether the Rassemblement National, the far right, will get in, because they've done really well in the European assemblies. Let's see how it goes, and lots of different reasons as to why he called that election, and whether it's trying to goad the far right into actually being successful, ruling for a bit, and then everyone realizing they're a bit crap at ruling, or whether he's trying to solidify people against the Rassemblement National so that you get a parliament that isn't Rassemblement National. But that seems to be somewhat unlikely. The left are coalescing, the right are coalescing, and the centrists, which is where Macron is, getting squeezed out. So it's not 522, Thierry told me, it's 577 different districts in France. I think the centrists are only on to win, say, 41 of them or something. So, and they are the people that are most obviously supporting Ukraine. Anyway, as Rahman said here, there is an emerging view in Brussels and the EU capitals that RN, the Rassemblement National, will, quote, moderate. They'll do a Giorgia Meloni. So Giorgia Meloni, the Italian leader, far right, went into coalition with 2 other far right parties, got into power, and then actually moderated a lot of her extremes and became a bit more pro-EU, and sits on the ECR group in the European Parliament, which is not the EPP, like the centre-right group. It sits to the right of them, but they are actually aligned more with Europe, not being so overly Eurosceptical. However, Rassemblement National are in the next group over, the Identity group, who are definitely anti-Europe. So there's a little bit of a difference there. So, people in Brussels and the EU capitals hoping the Rassemblement National would go the Giorgia Meloni route. With their eyes on the Elysee in 2027. So the idea is that it's not all about 2024 right now, but Rassemblement National want the presidency, want Macron's job, with Marine Le Pen in having that in 2027. The last thing they'll want is a Liz Truss crisis. In other words, going like full on right-wing neoliberal and destroying the economy with like tax breaks for the rich. Basically, Liz Truss was our prime minister in the UK for like 42 days and then wrecked it like straight away because she went crazy to the right in terms of real right-wing economic policies that were just super unpopular. Why that's important, you'll understand why that's important in a second, as a parallel. So this is naive. The RN won't want chaos, but they will also relish a fight with Brussels. When presenting his revised ideas on Monday, Jordan Bardella, so the one who's likely to be prime minister, not president, but prime minister for RN, did shelve many of his most expensive and problematic pledges. So when he came out and gave his speech about the new elections and the manifesto type thing, they are going to abolish VAT, value-added tax, on lots of goods and exempting under 30s from income tax. They were going to do that, but it looks like they're going to abolish those ones because they're too expensive. But at the same time, many fiscally consequential bits do remain. The Rassemblement National still wants to cut VAT on all energy from 20 to 5.5%, going against the EU laws on VAT. They want to recoup these billions of euros by withholding France's contribution to the EU budget. So we're not going to pay into the EU, and we're going to slash stuff here. So it's real populist stuff. We're going to make you happier because you're not going to be paying all these taxes on stuff, and we'll balance the budget by just not paying into the EU. But of course, you've got to remember a lot of that money from the EU comes back into France, although they are net contributors. So a lot of it does go outside as well. For example, to Ukraine. Opening up another front in their conflict with Brussels, they want to abolish Macron's pension reform. So Macron recognised that 62 is, you need to change the retirement age, and this is highly controversial because people wanted to be able to still retire at 62, even though people are getting older, and you've got a very different demographic sort of pyramid. It's gone like that. So instead of very few people at the top being old and needing to be sustained by everyone below them in the pyramid, this is what's happening in the Western world in general and in China, is that society's going like that, and where you have more people at the top needing to be sustained by fewer people below, because birth rates don't that's why a lot of people like immigration, not from a social cohesion point of view. It's like, we need people to sustain all this growing old people at the top, so we need taxpayers to come in, and if we're not going to give birth to them, we need a growing population. But unfortunately, we don't have an economic system that can deal with stagnant populations. That's what you need. You need an economic system that can cope with not growth. And until you get that, you are going to want to get people either being born or immigrants coming in. And both of those things have issues, because you can't grow unfettered in either of those ways. It's not sustainable because there's only finite resources and finite space. So until we find a solution to this, there's going to be an issue. So the RM wants to cut... these are all costly measures at a time where the EU Commission is looking for fiscal restraint from France and a few other member states. Does this sound like Rassemblement National is moderating? Even if they are a tad, they're not, and won't to the extent that is necessary. So the RM party strategists believe they can get away with a flip-flop if they lean into the cultural and identity parts of their platform, e.g. abolishing constitutional right of babies born on French soil to be French, or creating a national preference for some social welfare payments. But again, the first policy that would put Le Pen government on a collision course with France's Independent Constitutional Council. The second, by discriminating against other EU nationals, would open up another front in their fight with Brussels. On Monday, Bardella also surprised people by including several Macronist ideas on the need to reindustrialise France. This is also not a signal the far right is moderating. More likely, it suggests a catch-all desire to say all the things to all voter groups to try and boost RN's score on Sunday. Right, what's interesting there is this is what Reform have had to do in the UK. So Nigel Farage's Reform realised that Brexit stole a bunch of people from Labour who were left-wing, old-school, left-wing, working-class voters who didn't like particularly immigration and those kind of issues. So they took them from Labour, and in order to keep them, in order to appeal to them, they have to have a culturally right-wing approach, but an economically at times left-wing approach. So Reform have got this weird collection on their manifesto, their contract, that has things like, well, 50% of utilities are going to be renationalised. So that's going to appeal to those working-class left-wing voters who have come to you on right-wing cultural issues. And this is exactly what Rassemblement National will be looking to do. So it becomes this weird... So UKIP used to be sold by Nigel Farage as a libertarian party. Of course, it can't be libertarian if the first thing you're doing is restricting people from moving. It's like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, like, you know, as what was she, a second-generation illegal immigrant herself? Ayn Rand was like, if you look at the Libertarian Party manifesto in the US, like the actual true libertarians talk about immigration, open borders, essentially. So I call these people faux libertarians. I wrote a piece on UKIP back in 2016 or whenever it was, saying you can't be libertarian if the very first thing you're saying is people can't move. Like people are the individual gods in libertarian like ideology, and so you know there is an issue there. So when you're looking at where parties like Rassemblement National, Reform place themselves, it is becoming more and more of a motley policy agenda where actually some of those policies I would agree with, right, as a kind of centrist economically and a socially left-wing person. I would agree with some of Reform's policies, even though I massively disagree with Nigel Farage and a lot of his ideology, because they're picking and choosing to try and get this, as it says here, catch-all desire. It's also important to remember the political family in which RN sits in Brussels is the ID group and not the ECR group. That's what I talked about, the one that's like vehemently sort of Eurosceptic. The ECR has proven itself willing to work with Ursula von der Leyen. So that is, you know, Giorgia Meloni's group in the ECR in the European Parliament. But the ID group, where Le Pen and others are, oppose Ursula von der Leyen's agenda and have no intention to work constructively with her. So if Rassemblement National get into the French Assembly, then you've got an issue with how France works itself with the EU, given that France is a massive member of the EU. It's huge. It's like one of the cornerstones of the EU, and yet you will have one of the parties operating in the National Assembly being anti-EU. So for ideological and electoral reasons, Le Pen also can't bow to the EU too quickly, especially to any perceived diktat from Brussels. How can they, in power, deliver an agenda that looks and smells like one that Emmanuel Macron or another leader who Edouard Philippe or another centre-right government would deliver? Any fight with Brussels will, of course, send worrying signals to investors. This is a really important thing to remember as well. It's like when you have big political changes like this, it's not just about political chaos that takes place, but actually economic chaos that might ensue. And that gives investors cold feet, and that's not good for the economy. And actually, that's something that needs to be considered for France. So it will build market pressure and ultimately force a course correction. Indeed, in the worst case scenario, the EU will depend on, even hope for, market pressure to rein in Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen. So it might be that, yeah, you can't do all the crazy things you want to do, because if you do, it'll be economic suicide. So we're going to put pressure on you, and we're the ones that effectively fund you. as a country or maybe as a party. And so it could be that they succumb to those kind of pressures. How bad and how messy this gets is unknowable. Again, the RN certainly wants to avoid an economic crisis. In his Financial Times interview, Bardella says he does, quote, not intend to go to war with Brussels, but the RN would immediately break future integration, common financing for EU defence, Ukraine's enlargement, or enlargement of the EU with Ukraine coming in. So he's going to be against stuff like that. While unpicking many fundamental bits of the existing EU, can the RN also jettison its entire programme under pressure from Macron, the Constitution, EU and markets? Bardella and Le Pen have probably not thought these implications through, something their final programme, an incoherent mix of populism, socialism and bits of Macron's liberalism, suggests. As a result, some trial of strength with the EU and the market seems likely if they win. Really interesting, and it's the long weeds of how Rassemblement National would or wouldn't cope with having power in France and the pressures they're going to be under. And possibly the idea here that they haven't really thought through some of their crazy ideas or some of their more extreme ideas, because actually that could set France back seriously and economically and politically and so on and so forth. At the same time, there's another bit of a scandal brewing, perhaps. Marine Le Pen's party security advisor is an alleged Russian agent. So Ms. Volokova became a French citizen in 2020. Oh, look, her security advisor has only been in France for 4 years. There's Ms. Volokova. I wonder where she's from. Despite a leaked report from the DGSI, so that's a French intelligence, France's domestic intelligence services, that identified her as a suspected agent of influence working for Vladimir Putin's Russia. Goodness me, who knew? If you want to watch a really good French series, there are two of my favourite series of all time are Engrenage, which is Spiral. That's what the translation, that's how they translate it. Spiral is really great. All series of that. I love it. Police drama in Paris. And then Bureau de Légende, which is about the DGSI. And that's a fantastic set of series. Really, really good. So go and find those out. Now, finally, talking about Rassemblement National, moving to Nigel Farage, because it's a similar kind of party. Here we have RT now just platforming Farage. So if you want to know who the bad guys are, look at to whom RT endorse. And here they are endorsing good old Nigel. So here, as Greg Bagwell says, we can't see this in the UK because they lost their broadcasting license. That's Russia Today. But Russia Today, a Russian state-sponsored outlet, are using a UK parliamentary candidate's words to push their own agenda, their own propaganda. That should be ringing the alarm bells off the wall. RT says, Farage tells Zelensky only peace can save Ukraine. Quote from Farage here, all we are talking about is Ukraine is going to win? Really? I'm pretty skeptical about that. Nigel Farage, British politician, says RT. So just an interesting instance there of giving us an indication, I think, of who we should probably support going forward. Probably not someone that Russia Today is singing the praises of. Anyway, that's my tuppence. Thanks for watching. Sorry that was a bit of a long one with regard to France, but hopefully useful or interesting for some people. Take care of everybody. Speak to you soon.